Hi, Dr. Andrews. We have a couple of participants on the line, actually over 300. Do you want to start?
How many people on the line?
We have, it's about 361 on the line.
Oh, okay, is it our time now? Because then I guess we should start.
It is 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Okay, let's start then. Shall I start, Mongi?
Yes, please go ahead, Dr. Andrews.
Good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon to our esteemed panelists. I'd just like to personally welcome you on behalf of the South African UNESCO National Bioethics Committee, specifically the Webinar Planning Committee. I believe this is the first national dialogue we might be having on the important topic of equity and access to COVID-19 vaccines. So I'm very pleased to have a very diverse lineup of speakers from different backgrounds, and I believe we also have quite a diverse number of participants who have registered from various backgrounds, from academics, scientists, policymakers, community activists and NGOs, researchers, etc. So we're very pleased. By yesterday, we had just under 1,600 participants registered. So some people may still be coming online as we go along. As you can see here, we have the program in front of us. I'm Dr. Gail Andrews. I'm a member of the UNESCO National Bioethics Committee, and myself and Ms. Glodina Lewitz are co-chairing the meeting. I would just like to ask everybody to be mindful of a few housekeeping rules. This is, among other, to please put your cell phones on silent, and also to encourage all of you to use your Q&A function to pose any questions to the presenters after their presentations, or even while they're presenting as the questions come to you. I'd also like to ask the panelists to keep their eye on the Q&A function so that they can note in the meantime questions that may be specifically directed at them. And yeah, I think that's about it. The chat function, we will try to minimize use, but people are free to make comments or any contribution should they not have the opportunity at the end of the meeting to pose questions, since our time is very limited. Glodina, are you on the meeting already? Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Good day, it's Glodina Lewitz, also a member of the UNESCO Bioethics Committee, and welcome to this meeting. And I'm looking forward that we have an open discussion on issues around access. Thank you.
Thanks, Glodina. Colleagues, then without further ado, I'd like to call on our colleague, Professor Sophia Mohammed, to please do some introductory remarks. She's also one of our members on the National Bioethics Committee. Thank you. Over to you, Glodina. Sorry, over to you, Prof.
Thanks, Dr. Andrews. Hello, colleagues. A very special welcome to each one of you joining us today. As Dr. Andrews mentioned, there are over 1,200 registered participants in this session, a testament to the critical and timely nature of this discussion around where we stand regarding a COVID-19 vaccine, who gets it, and when. As soon as news of the pandemic took us by storm earlier this year, and as all of our lives changed, discussion around when a vaccine would become available started trending almost immediately. And so, as light starts to shine through the clouds, with news of potential vaccines that could be ready for use, possibly very soon, here we are, at the precipice of a defining moment for public health, where the challenge is unprecedented. Some of the questions we are now faced with include, what do we know and don't we know about the vaccines? How do we make enough vaccines for hundreds of millions of people? And where do we stand as a continent and nation when the skewed imbalances regarding equitable access to a people's vaccine are already at play? Several high-income countries have already secured millions of doses contractually by way of advance purchase agreements. Then what happens to us in lower middle-income countries? In addition, how do we overcome conspiracy theories and hesitation towards a vaccine when misinformation and myths have cast doubt on the value of vaccines in recent decades and even more so now? Equally important is whether we have the systems in place to manage vaccine rollout and delivery. Will our health systems cope? And will our country afford to pay not only for the vaccines, but all the added costs involved in distribution and rollout? Then perhaps the most thorny question, who will be prioritized in vaccine rollout and who should and will receive the vaccine first? As we will see, this is all very complex, and it is essential that we ask ourselves as one South African community and civil society, how do we respond? What role can we also play towards ensuring access for all in solidarity with our fellow countrywomen and men? In other words, what are our joint responsibilities? It is predicted that lower to middle income countries will obtain around 2 billion doses of vaccines by the end of 2021. However, as the second wave of infections loom, government has been silent regarding its rollout plan. Communicating in an open and transparent manner about how vaccines will be distributed and when this is anticipated is key to building trust. What we are currently missing is a clear and consistent message from our leaders. Colleagues, today we host the second webinar of the South African National Bioethics Committee of the UNESCO. A little bit about the committee. Chaired by Prof Salim S, it was established last year and operates within the framework of UNESCO's Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. The establishment and operation of the NBC for South Africa is tailored to our country's needs, background, culture, history, and tradition. We are a committee of the Social and Human Sciences sector of the National Commission for UNESCO. The authority under which the NBC is established is the South African National Commission for UNESCO under the auspices of the National Minister of Basic Education. Amongst our mandates is that of responding to ethical and human rights bioethical challenges with particular reference to matters of national interest. And that is what we are here for today. At the outset, I want to stress that while our panelists are all male, a strong team of women in the NBC have made this event possible and will robustly respond to the panelists and at the same time field the questions and comments that you will have. Dr. Gail Andrews and Ms. Claudina Lutz, as co-organizers of the NBC's webinar subcommittee, thank you. Once again, thank you all for attending. We look forward to the presentations from our expert panel and to your involvement in the Q&A session. Let us now open a dialogue in determining where we stand regarding a COVID-19 vaccine and what the concerns are for our communities. Over to you, Dr. Andrews.
Thank you, Safia. It's actually Claudina Lutz here. Thank you for setting the scene, and let's now start the discussion as such. I just want to introduce Professor Salim Abdool Karim, a South African clinical infectious disease epidemiologist with quite wide recognition internationally. He's the director for CAPRISA, the Center for AIDS Program of Research in South Africa, and he's also got links to the Columbia University, Harvard University, Cornell University, as well as his homegrown KwaZulu-Natal University. He's the co-chair of the South African Ministerial Advisory on COVID-19, a member of the African Task Force for Coronavirus, and also of the Lancet Commission on COVID-19. Thank you, Slim. We are looking forward to your inputs.
Thank you very much, Sudhir. It's indeed a pleasure and an honor to be with you here this afternoon. I have been given the very pleasant responsibility to share with you today my thoughts on the recent COVID-19 vaccine trial results. So what do they mean for South Africa? That's the question. I hope at the end of the next 20 minutes, you will have some impressions of exactly what they mean for South Africa. And the way in which I plan to do that is I'll start off by just briefly, very briefly, talking about the urgent need for a vaccine, but focusing on the current vaccine trial results. And then I'll tell you about what don't we know yet and what do we know. I'll then talk about what is expected in terms of the pipeline, and then I'll talk about what is the goal. What are we trying to achieve with the vaccine? I'll talk specifically about herd immunity and the importance of looking at efficacy and to understand and appreciate what it's going to take to achieve herd immunity. I'll talk very briefly on vaccine nationalism and hesitancy, and then I'll end off with providing a perspective about the 5 criteria that we would use in order to look at the most appropriate vaccine for South Africa. So let's start. What do we know about this epidemic? Well, it's a runaway train. If you look at the diagram on the right-hand side, that's the 7-day average of the number of confirmed new cases globally. This is not cumulative. This is just each day how many cases are occurring. And you can see we passed the 500,000 mark quite a while back. So this epidemic is at present showing no signs of easing. It is continuing, particularly in terms of the second waves that are occurring in many countries. It's continuing its rampant path. And there are 3 key things that I thought I would touch on. The first is that almost all populations are still at risk, even in those populations that have had a severe first wave, which was shown very nicely in the studies done in Manaus in Brazil, where 66%, 2 out of every 3 people in Manaus had antibodies against this virus from the first wave. They are now in the midst of a terrible second wave. The stay-at-home orders and all of the restrictions we're doing, we're already seeing how difficult it is for people to maintain those restrictions, how difficult it is for them to maintain their social distancing, washing their hands, maintaining their masks. We're just seeing how all of that has been steadily decreasing over time. And then finally, this is not something a single country can beat. Even though countries like New Zealand and many of the island nations have been able to slow the virus and indeed end up in a situation where they have no local transmission for weeks on end, it all simply comes back because no one in an interconnected and globalized world, you really can't defeat this virus on your own. This virus has exacerbated and helped us understand our interdependence and how it's not really practical for anybody to be safe unless everyone is safe. So there's clearly an urgent need. So what have we learned about the vaccine trial results? Well, the number one thing, until Pfizer announced their results, humankind had never made a vaccine against a coronavirus before. Indeed, if you had asked me, could we make a vaccine against coronavirus? I would have said, sure, we can, but we've never done it before, so I don't know if we ever will. Well, they've answered that question. Yes, we can make a vaccine against the coronavirus, and a highly efficacious one at that. So if we look at Pfizer's, the Pfizer-BioNTech candidate, it was shown to be 95% effective with 170 endpoints, and that's their final outcome. So this is not an interim result. There were 162 infections in the placebo group, and there were only 8 infections in the group that received the vaccine. The vaccine itself was 2 doses of a messenger RNA. Now you have to know that there are no other vaccines with messenger RNA. This is a completely new technology. We saw its very exciting potential a few years ago in a set of animal studies, but we never made a vaccine with it before. Now we're seeing its potential. The efficacy, importantly, in this trial was consistent across all of the different criteria, whether it was age. In other words, this vaccine is as effective in the old versus young, men versus women, doesn't matter about anything else. This was a large study with over 43,000 people, and there were no serious safety concerns, at least in the short term. The company itself has produced about 50 million doses for this year and planning another 1.3 billion for next year. A handicap is that in the way in which this vaccine was being manufactured and stored, it needs to be stored at -70 degrees Celsius. So that's an ultra freezer, not freezers you would find normally. These are freezers you would find usually in research laboratories, and they're not readily found elsewhere. So any attempt to distribute this will need to ensure you can deal with the storage requirements. The estimated cost, and this is just a very rough estimate from the company, is about $20 per dose. So it's certainly not a cheap vaccine. So that's what we've learned about the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Next, shortly on its heels, we saw the results from the Moderna. Moderna is actually a much more smaller biotech company, unlike Pfizer, which is a large pharmaceutical company. Moderna is more like BioNTech. It's a small organization. Their vaccine, similarly, a messenger RNA given as 2 doses. In the case of Moderna, it's given about 3 weeks apart. The vaccine itself was 94.5% effective from 95 endpoints. There were 90 cases in the placebo and 5 in the vaccine. Now, it's important to know that because then we're actually seeing the nitty-gritty of the actual results when we can see the actual distributions. It was in over 30,000 volunteers, and it was a study done only in the US. About a quarter of the participants are old, so we have a pretty good sense of the fact that the vaccine is effective in old people as well as young people across the different races. The vaccine itself, this messenger RNA, it remains stable in conventional refrigerators for about a month and in ordinary -20-degree freezers for up to 6 months. I actually suspect the Pfizer-BioNTech will also produce similar stability data. They're in the midst of looking at that in their stability studies. And so I suspect Pfizer will probably end up with a similar situation in a few weeks' time. The cost of the Moderna vaccine is about $35 a dose, so it's a little bit more expensive. These are pretty high prices for vaccines, but it's a function of the technology and the way in which the mRNA needs to be made. The third was shortly after the Pfizer results, in fact, the Gamaleya National Center, which is part of the Russian government. It's like the equivalent of our NICD. It's a government research institution. They announced their results, 92% effective, but a very small number of endpoints. Very early in the study, a preliminary result, 18 in the placebo group, 2 in the vaccinated group. In my view, too early to really make anything conclusive. Just promising results. Let's wait till we get more endpoints. This is a different platform. In this vaccine that Gamaleya has made, this is a viral vector vaccine. It uses 2 different vectors. It uses a recombinant adenovirus 5, followed by a recombinant adenovirus 26. The interim analysis was done on the first 16,000 participants. The trial itself has enrolled just over 40,000 participants, but we haven't seen the results on all 40,000 yet. There's a bit of a controversy around this vaccine for two reasons. One is that they haven't actually published their protocol, which is very strange because in the world of science, you publish your trial protocols, it's a requirement to put them on clinicaltrials.gov or one of these websites. But they've chosen not to do that. So we actually don't know how they measure the endpoints because we haven't seen their protocol. And this vaccine was approved even before the first set of preliminary results were available for limited use in Russia. We have no idea what this vaccine will cost, but it'll be substantially cheaper than the mRNA candidates. And then finally, the fourth of the 4 trials that have released their results was in the last few days. We heard about the AstraZeneca Oxford University vaccine trial results, where they showed that the vaccine itself was 70% effective, 131 endpoints. Within the trial, they have 2 different regimens. They have one that uses 2 full doses a month apart. And in that regimen, it was shown to be 62% effective. That regimen has the large number of the participants. It has about 9,000, close to 9,000 participants. And the second regimen, which is the first, same as the first, except that the initial dose is at half the quantity. So you have a first dose, which is low, and then a second full dose. And that was found to be 90% effective. But it's still a small study with fewer endpoints. So again, don't want to make too much of this at this point. It might be that a first lower dose might be better in terms of overall efficacy. Still early to tell. When you start increasing your number of endpoints, some of these big effects can sometimes disappear. What's interesting about this vaccine, also a new technology, just like the Gamaleya vaccine. It's a viral vector vaccine, uses a chimp adeno, not a human adeno. There are very specific concerns around human adenos, one of which is that humans have already encountered them before. So you may get a different and a more vigorous immune response to the actual vector than the vaccine itself. In the interim data that we have seen from Oxford comes only from around the 11,000 or 12,000 odd volunteers from the UK and Brazil. The South African data are not included in this. This vaccine and the viral vector vaccines can generally be stored in a standard fridge. They don't need a lot of refrigeration. They don't need low temperatures to be stored at. One of the interesting things, of course, was that Oxford University had negotiated with the Serum Institute of India to make several million doses on an at-risk basis. In other words, they were just hoping it would work and they were going to make it anyway. And so they have the largest quantities of the vaccine already available. 200 million doses are anticipated to be made by the Serum Institute of India just this year. And then their plans are to scale up, if the vaccine works, to around 100 million doses per month next year. The cost is lower. We're now talking about a cost of around $4 per dose. And so we're getting a better sense of, how all these vaccines stack up in terms of effectiveness or efficacy. We're getting some idea of the technology. How much can we rely on their data based on the number of participants that have been involved? How effective is it across different groups? Do they have quantities available? And what is it going to cost? So we've learned a lot from these 4 vaccine trial results. So impressive results, but what don't we know about these 4 vaccines from the current trial results? On the right-hand side, I've shown you a diagram that provides the data on the 4 trials. Let's talk about the 6 things that we don't yet know. The first is we don't know the full results. And, for a scientist, that's like, you feel like, eating your nails because you want to know what the data show. These high-level numbers, don't really help you understand and to look at the reliability and to understand the actual trial and the results. We want to see it all. And so we wait very patiently for the peer-reviewed publications. And so that's what we expect to occur pretty soon. These companies rightfully have put a lot of emphasis on trying to get their regulatory documentation through, and so they have deprioritized or they haven't come up with their papers in journals yet, which I anticipate will be pretty soon. The second is study endpoint details. Now that's quite important because if these trials are measuring their endpoints differently, we can't really establish whether we're comparing apples with apples. In other words, if one trial is looking at hospitalization or more severe endpoints, and another is looking at the full spectrum, in other words, mild and severe endpoints, then we're not comparing the same things. And so when we say one is 95% effective and one is 92% effective, we don't know whether that's real because we don't know whether we're comparing the same thing. Third is, does each vaccine protect against the full spectrum of disease? Does it protect against asymptomatic infection? Because asymptomatic infection could be important as a reservoir that's leading to the transmission of the virus, even though it's asymptomatic and we won't be concerned from a clinical point of view. And then the three questions that can't be answered right now, even if we had the published data, because they just need a lot more time to answer those questions. The first is, what is the long-term and the scale-up safety? If it's safe, as we know now, after a few months, will it be safe after a year? Obviously, we don't know the answer to that. We've only had the epidemic now for the last 11 months or so. So we don't even know what the safety is going to be in the long term. We wait to see what that will be. Second is, what is correlating with protection? Are antibody levels? Is it T-cell immunity? Is it a combination of the two? Very important because that will enable us to fast-track development, have some idea of establishing who is protected and who is not. So that becomes quite an important question to answer, but that takes time because it's a lot of laboratory research that goes into that. And finally, how long will the vaccine's protection last? A big question. We don't know the answer to that. Looking at the data, because the antibody levels are pretty high, I'm pretty optimistic it will last for quite a while, but we don't yet know. And the reason we don't know is because reinfection, we know, occurs. It does occur from natural infection, but it seems it's uncommon in the first few months. And this is a superb study, just came out this week from the group at Oxford University, where they followed the hospital staff. And they showed that in the 11,000 or so hospital staff that did not have exposure to the virus, no antibodies, 89 of them became infected. In the 1,200 hospital staff that had exposure to the virus, had infection, had antibodies, none became infected. So that's a pretty telling outcome that you don't really see. Sorry, this is not about infection. This is about symptomatic infection. We're not seeing symptomatic infection at least in the short term, because this is a study done over only a few months. So it looks like reinfection does occur, but does not occur in to any great extent. What do we know about other news that's coming out? Well, there's more good news, I say, is expected and along the way. There are 12 vaccine trials in late stages. We've heard about the 4 results. The other 8 are on the right-hand side. I've just provided you with their logos, some of which are already actually approved for limited use in the individual countries like China. But there are many of these vaccines that we would look forward to seeing their results. And these vaccines, importantly, between the 12, the 4 that's already come out and the 8 that's still coming out, there are many different types of vaccines. And I've provided that to you at the bottom. Some of them are protein subunits, some of them are nucleic acid, like the mRNA. So these are all, they're very different. That's very important because the different technologies, some are easy to manufacture, some are not. Some are cheap to manufacture, some are not. Some have long-term safety that we know well, some don't. So if anything happens to any one candidate, we've got another candidate to fall back on. So this diversity we're seeing in the 12 trials is going to be quite important. So let me end off with the last point I want to make, which is about attaining herd immunity. So we know from this excellent paper in The Lancet by Roy Anderson. Roy Anderson is like the doyen of herd immunity and mathematical modeling of infectious diseases. He basically shares with us a formula we know well about how to calculate herd immunity. It's basically 1 minus 1 over R naught. Now, if we take that R naught for SARS-CoV-2 is somewhere between 2.5 and about 3.5. And this comes from about 11 different studies, most of which actually are from China, that estimated R naught pre-lockdown. And you get some idea of that's probably in that range is its R naught. R naught is the number of people that will get infected from one infected individual. So let's, for simplicity, and this is for illustrative purposes only, let's argue that R naught is 3, just to make it easy. Then the estimated level of antibody protection or immune protection that we need is going to be 66.7%. In other words, 2 out of every 3 people need to have immunity against the virus for us to have herd immunity. Herd immunity is desired because when we achieve that level of herd immunity, then the virus will not spread readily within the community. There still will be spread, as occurs often with herd immunity, but it'll be contained and you won't get runaway spread. So if we have a 95% efficacious vaccine, like we do with the Pfizer-BioNTech, then we will need to achieve 70.5% coverage. In other words, 7 out of every 10 South Africans will have to be vaccinated in order to achieve herd immunity. If, however, we are choosing to go with a vaccine that's only 80% efficacious, we'll need to vaccinate 83.8%. So in other words, that's now leading us to more than 8 out of every South Africans would need to be vaccinated. If we choose to go with a vaccine that's only 70% efficacious, we basically have to immunize almost everybody in our entire country in order to get 67%. You can imagine that if your vaccine is only, say, 67% efficacious and you need 67% for herd immunity, that means everybody needs to be vaccinated. That's very difficult to achieve. To get everybody vaccinated is very difficult. To get anything over 80% vaccinated will be a challenge. It's doubly a challenge for this reason, that we already have some vaccine hesitancy in this country. In 2 surveys that were undertaken in several countries, and I'm showing you South Africa is about the 4th from the bottom. Here's South Africa, I'm pointing to it. In these 2 surveys, they asked the question, if a vaccine against COVID-19 were available, I would get it. What proportion agreed to that? Well, in August, we were at around 63%. In October, we're getting better. We're one of the few countries getting better, actually, and we were up to 67%. So let's work on the basis that roughly about a third of our population may be hesitant about taking a vaccine. Well, that gives you just some idea of how challenging it's going to be to get to a herd immunity level of 67%. Now, remember, herd immunity, we don't know its exact level yet. I've just given you, for illustrative purposes, I've used 67%. True herd immunity is probably within a much broader range and will differ. In a high density setting will be different to a rural setting. The WHO, for example, regards herd immunity for COVID-2 roughly between 60 and 80%. So let me deal next with the last issue I want to touch on, which is vaccine nationalism. And in vaccine nationalism, I want to show you that if you look at, in this particular diagram from the Economist, if you look at AstraZeneca, Novavax, Sanofi, and Pfizer, each of them and their manufacturing capacity has already been spoken for by several countries. You can see that India has already secured substantial quantities of AstraZenecas and Novavaxes vaccines. The EU, similarly, the US, of course, has secured large quantities. COVAX has secured much less. And remember, COVAX covers a much wider number of countries. And if you look on the left-hand side, countries like Canada have already secured about, well, almost 10 doses for every person they have. So they already are buying up vaccines, much, much more than they actually need. A place like Australia has bought 5 doses per person. And the reason they're doing this is because they don't know which vaccine is going to work. So they hedge their bets and they buy several different vaccines on the basis that they have pre-ordered the vaccine that's going to work. So that's going to present a problem, because our more immediate problem, before we even get to vaccine hesitancy, is can we get enough vaccine? Can we get enough to at least vaccinate the 67% of the population we need? So let me end off with 5 key considerations. If we are going to select a vaccine, given that we're going to see within the next 2 months or so, we'll probably see most of those 12 trials reporting. We will have, I suspect, many of those vaccines are going to show efficacy. They're going to vary quite a bit. And we will have about 10 or 12 results available to choose from. And when you take, maybe not to choose from, but to at least make some assessment of those candidates. How would we do that? Well, the first thing we do is we never compromise on safety. We want a vaccine that's safe. The second is we want a vaccine that's efficacious. The higher the efficacy, the better. And you've seen the importance of high efficacy in the calculations I already showed. So once we have a safe and a highly effective vaccine, then we want to consider issues of cost, ease of storage and administration, and then secondly, thirdly, is whether it's a single dose or 2 doses. So for example, the J&J vaccine, they are testing a single dose. Giving a single dose, firstly, it's half the price. Secondly, it's logistically a lot easier to do. So it'll be much better for us to go with a single dose vaccine, even if it's slightly less efficacious. So that's how we're going to have to balance these 5 factors. And our goal, to achieve herd immunity. Why are we doing all of this? Because what we want to see is we want to see the end of the coronavirus, and we want to add to our coronavirus prevention toolbox all of these things that we have, all of these technologies that we already have that can help us protect us from the coronavirus. We want to add a vaccine, and a vaccine would tilt this toolbox enormously with the value it would add to our ability to protect ourselves from the coronavirus. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Professor Abdool Karim, for an excellent presentation and reminding us how the COVID pandemic has taught us how interdependent we are on each other, or just how we depend on each other to maintain good public health as citizens. You've also highlighted a number of very important points for us and taken us through all the current vaccine trials and the results and what this means for us, both in terms of feasibility in third world or developing country contexts because of costs and storage considerations. And you've also highlighted what we don't know yet, even from the trials that have already that are already quite far advanced and have reached phase 3. And you have highlighted the very important problem of vaccine nationalism, where countries like Australia and Canada have already bought more than what they actually need for their citizens. And I think that would be an apt moment for me to pause and then to welcome our next speaker. Before I do so, though, there's a number of questions for you already in the chat, Prof. And maybe it will be wise for you to look at them. Some of them you have answered, but you can start collecting your thoughts on your responses. I'd then like to move to our next presentation, where Mr. Jens Pedersen will be speaking to us about the very topic of COVID-19 vaccines and whether this will just be another example of African exclusion. Mr. Jens Pedersen is a senior humanitarian policy and diplomatic advisor for Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, as we know it. And he's got immense experience in a number of areas, which I won't highlight here because I think we have circulated the profiles or bio sketches of all the presenters. Over to you, Mr. Pedersen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrews, and thanks for having me on this panel. I'll echo Prof Salim in it being a great honor, and I appreciate the opportunity to address this very important issue. When we talk about the issue of equity in terms of vaccines or an equitable distribution, which is what's at the crux of the actually global response to COVID-19, as Prof Salim and many others have indicated as well, no country, no region can do it alone, and thus it requires very much a global and a concerted and coherent effort. Now, we must accept that there can be no equity as it is now because we have very limited transparency. We have very limited transparency when it comes to what is the process of accessing a vaccine once it is developed. Now, the development process of vaccines, as Prof Salim said, is very transparent apart from a few development processes, but the standard, the norm and the custom is that development and the research and data that informs the development of vaccine has to be transparent. Now, that's where the transparency essentially stops once a vaccine has been developed. And that's one of the cornerstones as to why we will struggle with truly equitable distribution. There's very strong reason to be skeptical, I think, when it comes to whether we will achieve equity. Prof Salim mentioned vaccine nationalism and a very illustrative graph of countries which are buying or pre-purchasing potentially vaccines to a much larger extent than their populations. We've seen similar initiatives fail in the past with regards to COVID, but also with regards to other outbreaks. A lot of people have almost forgotten about the Ebola outbreak that ravaged West Africa in 2014, 2016 as well, or in that period, which was another great example of rapid development of a vaccine. The challenge is that that vaccine, the development and manufacturing of that vaccine remains at the hands of one manufacturer. There are two vaccines, one which has remained the most used one, but both remains in the hands of single manufacturers. Now, early on in the COVID-19 pandemic as well, we saw, even within the European Union as an example, solidarity, so-called solidarity mechanisms for equitable distribution, even within the EU itself, didn't last very long. It only lasted that long as supply of, in this case, PPEs and other crucial equipment was made available to individual countries. Now, there's little reason to believe that that'll be any different when it comes to vaccines. And again, the graphs and the presentation by Salim highlights that very much. Now, how do we then secure a truly equitable access to vaccines? We are having a lot of debates that essentially focus on distribution. However, we must accept that the underlying and fundamental components for equitable distribution or access, as they both are further down the chain, is going to be manufacturing. At the moment, there is a series of manufacturers, but the manufacturing still remains a very closed process, even to the point where the procurement whether it's COVAX, whether it's countries such as South Africa or some of the other countries that was presented, procure vaccines. We don't know at what prices these vaccines are being sold, at what prices they are being made available of. We do to some degree, but what's more importantly, we don't know what it costs to develop a vaccine, which makes it very, very difficult to determine what is actually a fair price. And as long as we don't know what is a fair price, it's going to be the demand, that's the price, which is, again, we have seen the wealthy countries being able to hoard vaccines at the expense of an actual and truly equitable distribution. Now, this is essentially a political issue. It's a political issue in the sense that we need, as Africa, to be stronger in making sure that we make demands when it comes to the ability for us to access vaccines. And I would argue demands for Africa to manufacture a vaccine. Now, I'll come back to some of the arguments against parts of this shortly. Some of the barriers, apart from pricing, that we face in equitable distribution is within the barriers of manufacturing. Patents and intellectual property rights pose very strong barriers to an actual manufacturing, equitable distribution and access. Now, it does that because, as we've seen with the Ebola vaccine, for example, a manufacturer can hold on to the recipe, so to say, of what is required in terms of technology, process, ingredients, and so forth. All of the different links of a vaccine development, from at the very basic entry level to dosages and so forth, can remain patented. That makes it incredibly complicated for countries in Africa or other developing countries to challenge that, simply because, as we know, we don't have the financial capability to buy at market price, and we don't have yet the technology to manufacture ourselves. Now, when we then have a global conversation, Prof Salim mentioned COVAX as a vaccine procurement and distribution mechanism. We are actually missing the target quite a bit, because the goal is not, should not be, about buying vaccines, because we are faced with a reality which is an incredibly limited supply with a very high demand. And we can see with COVAX and other development countries simply don't and won't have enough vaccines. So we have to go to the source of the problem, which is manufacturing. Now, some of the arguments against that is that manufacturers and developers a lot of money in the research and the process of developing a vaccine. Now, a lot of that money, a lot of the seed funding, as it's called, actually come from public investment. It comes from governments, it comes from universities. The trials that are being developed are supported by government. So when manufacturers indicate that the cost is very high, which it is, a large part of that cost is actually not paid by the manufacturers themselves. Another argument we often face is that we have to make sure that quality is guaranteed when we manufacture vaccines. Absolutely. There's no argument and there's no interest in developing substandard vaccines. However, to say that it cannot be done in Africa because we need to secure a reasonably and acceptable high level of quality of the end product is simply disingenuous. It can be done elsewhere, which means it can be done here as well. Africa is already manufacturing other vaccines as well. Another part of the arguments, in particular around COVID, that we are faced with when we try to argue that we need manufacturing capacity in Africa is that it's not going to help with the COVID-19 pandemic because we won't have time. Now, that is exactly part of the problem in the mechanisms that we are left with for Africa to access a vaccine. Now, those are based on procurement, which means that next time there will be a similar pandemic, and I think it's likely that it will be. when, not if, we will start all over and we will ask African governments, countries, or multilateral mechanisms to buy vaccines for Africa. Whereas if we invest rather in some of the more structural aspects allowing us to manufacture, we will, given, not necessarily develop COVID-19 relevant vaccines, but we will have a system that is much better prepared and ready to manufacture going forward. The challenge is that we have now is that we are faced with transparency, as I said, that lasts only for the research component. The moment we have a vaccine, transparency disappears. And we need to have transparency in order to make sure that we don't pay too high prices. Secondly, we need to challenge those monopolies, which is essentially what we are faced with as poor countries in accessing vaccines, the monopolies that manufacturers of vaccines are having. Monopolies that allow them to determine not only the price, but also the manufacturing essentially. So they control the price by controlling the supply in spite of very, very high demand. And lastly, we need transparency in order to counter vaccine hesitancy, which is a large part of today's conversation. Is how do we build trust in order to make sure that a vaccine is actually demonstrated to our communities that a vaccine is safe, it's efficacious, but we need to be able to demonstrate as well that the way we got the vaccine, the price we paid, was actually fair and transparent as well. And if we don't extend the transparency to the second part of actually rolling out a COVID-19 vaccines or any other vaccines for that matter, we are likely to continue to face vaccine hesitancy, in particular in countries where costs determine access as well. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Dr. Andrews.
Thank you, Jens, for your contribution and highlighting some of the hurdles that we have to cross and that we need to keep in mind when we look at vaccines and how we can actually access it from an African side. So we will carry on with the debate on that. And I then want to introduce Tian, who is the founder and strategist of the African Alliance, an NGO that works to advance social and political incentives for the realization of health rights for all. And is also a founding member of the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group, an international group of advocates that works around ensuring vaccine research is accountable, transparent, and community-owned. Tian, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Claudina. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having us on this really important platform. I'm just going to share my screen. Great. Can you confirm that my screen is visible, please?
Yes.
Great. So, colleagues, today I wanted to speak to you a bit about some of our thoughts and reflections within civil society, as we've really been since June, really, when the bulk of the civil society engagement work began. We found ourselves really overwhelmed by just the amount of research that was happening, the pipeline of news and developments and constant updates that we had witnessed around COVID-19, and really were forced into a position where we really had to interrogate what are our strengths and what are our strategic placements to contribute to not only the general movement for a COVID vaccine, but also to ensure that communities are not left behind, and perhaps more importantly, building on our historical work to ensure that science is held accountable. So in my thoughts that I will share with you today, I wanted to share with you some reflections from civil society in general since the onset of the pandemic, some thoughts on equity and accountability. I wanted to have a discussion around what do we know about access within the context of COVID-19 vaccine research, and touch on some priorities for vaccine rollout, and then end with the general call to action. So I want to open with this quote by Tedros Ghebreyesus, the leader of the WHO, where he said that no vaccines in history have been developed as rapidly as these. The scientific community has set a new standard for vaccine development. The urgency with which COVID-19 vaccines have been developed must be matched by the same urgency to distribute them fairly. And I think that's a fair point. And it resonated with us because these are the similar challenges we face with some other vaccine research that I'll build on in a moment. So in terms of some general reflections, one lesson that really stood out to us was that we need to never lose sight of history. Engagement, accountability, and how that happens, the need for civil society and communities to practice oversight of research that happens in their communities was an important one. Also important was constantly reminding ourselves that politics, power, and money have and continue to drive and shape the global response to COVID-19 today. We've recognized that research is happening at unprecedented speed and volume. We've also seen that the role of researchers, donors, regulators, and governments are under rightful heightened scrutiny. Community engagement consistently falling on the wayside. A common refrain that we hear from folks who are running trials is that it's a pandemic, it's urgent, we need to get these answers. We've had principal investigators from well-known funded trials who have gone on national news and stated that community engagement is a sideshow, it is a luxury. Their job is to do the science. We've also noticed the impact of social distancing on communities' access to services in general that has been devastating, coupled with how this has also impacted the participation of communities in research. We've seen a further burden on an already under-resourced and strained civil society that is now having to take on significant additional and unfunded work to ensure that vaccine research is accountable, transparent, and community-owned, and ultimately equitable. We've also engaged with the growth and the development of COVAX, a global body that Slim touched on as well, tasked with ensuring the equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. This is a highly powerful body, but has also been highly resistant to engagement with independent civil society. COVAX agreed after months of lobbying and infighting to include civil society on crucial COVAX structures. So colleagues, at the very outset of this pandemic, we have seen how communities have consistently been sidelined, how civil society has consistently been blocked from entering spaces and tables where decisions are made. The general question applied not only to COVAX, but indeed a range of these global bodies, is that how do we hold these unelected but immensely powerful and well-resourced structures to account? Another lesson learned was that in the context of manufacturing globally, regionally, and locally, we can not only have one generic manufacturer of an eventual COVID-19 vaccine, and that AIDS taught us that we need multiple licenses to advance immediate and eventual equitable access. So what does equity look like in one of the most unequal countries in the world? Currently, we have a historically unjust, fragile, two-tiered, and inherently unequal health system that is now gearing up for NHI, with dysfunction rooted in apartheid and mirrored in present-day South Africa, with the majority of white people being able to pay for high-quality, accessible healthcare, and the Black majority being subject to the violence of the public healthcare system. One issue that has come up throughout the last few months, colleagues, is that we cannot talk about COVID-19 vaccine research development or even access in isolation. The vaccine is going to be arriving when it does in a context, and that context is at times very specific to South Africa. And so we as the African Alliance, and certainly as the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group, take every opportunity to bring people's minds back to the historical and current context in which communities access healthcare. Here's a flashback to 2013, a report entitled Death and Dying in the Eastern Cape that was done by the Treatment Action Campaign in Section 27, that listed off a range of challenges, ranging from the state of the health facilities, consistent stockouts, human resource challenges, mismanagement of resources, a patient and transport emergency medical service that was weakened at its core, outdated equipment, staff accommodation, impacting delivery of basic healthcare services, etc., etc. That was 2013. I don't think that we need to go over what is the current situation right now in the Eastern Cape. But of course, this is not unique to the Eastern Cape. But what it does do is it points to the ongoing calls, yet again, to use this new pandemic to further build and make progress to strengthen our public health system for the next pandemic that will undoubtedly come. Our thoughts on equitable access are that we can't realize access in the dark. And this hits a bit closer to home, because this involves conversations and relationships with researchers, with donors, with agencies that us in the HIV field have had for decades. And so they're important discussions to have. So colleagues, we can't realize access in the dark. Access agreements must matter to everyone. Where are these access agreements for COVID-19 trials happening in South Africa? Why is there minimal transparency in the context of a pandemic? You know, it's frequently mind-blowing to me that activists have to use already strained resources to fight for access to transparency around COVID-19 research. This research has received significant amount of government funding, yet commercial patent rights are going to take precedent. Civil society groups like the Health Justice Initiative and MSF have repeatedly reminded us that we cannot rely on charity and benevolence. We are currently hoping for access as there are no enforceable guarantees in place. Slim spoke about Canada and how Canada is overstocking. Are we going to end up in a place where we rely on Canada for a donation of COVID-19 vaccines? So civil society needs to keep the pressure up. We need to lay bare and remind communities of the political and financial power of pharma in research and how that manifests in the public health system. Government has to root its response on vaccine equity and allocation in the Constitution and health rights therein, and civil society will continue work to make sure that that happens. Now I want to introduce you to Albert. Albert Bourla is the CEO of Pfizer. And a few months ago, Albert said, the notion of vaccine developers foregoing profits on COVID-19 vaccines was very fanatic and radical. So colleagues, it was a slow English day for me. I went to the dictionary and I looked at the word fanatic, filled with or expressing excessive zeal, radical, relating to or affecting the fundamental nature of something far-reaching. So in this context, colleagues, what do we expect communities to think when our right to life, our right to exist, and the struggles for that existence free from disease is characterized in this case by one of the most powerful players currently in the global COVID-19 vaccine landscape as far-reaching and excessive? The same company, interestingly enough, whose tagline is breakthroughs that change patients' lives. The question is, which patients? I want to now look at some smoke and mirrors and the conversations that have been circling around AstraZeneca. In June 2020, AstraZeneca said they will provide doses of its vaccine at cost price until the pandemic finishes. In October 2020, in a leaked memo to the Financial Times, AstraZeneca said that they could declare the pandemic over as early as July 2021, and the pandemic period might be extended if AstraZeneca determines it's not over. So I want to repeat that. The pandemic period might be extended if AstraZeneca determines it's not over. However, a company spokesperson gave a caveat and said they will seek expert guidance, including from global organizations. So the question here really is, are we going to rely on Big Pharma to determine the end of the pandemic? The very end of which opens the floodgates for the same Big Pharma to profiteer from COVID-19 vaccines for its shareholders. I'd like to cover quickly some engagement for equity thoughts. For over a decade, we've been advocating for a bare minimum in terms of accountability and transparency in research, and by extension, engagement from protocol design to post-trial access. Apart from re-examining researchers' responsibility to engage with access issues early in trial design, we need to think about what does community engagement look like beyond community advisory boards. In nearly all of the instances where we've approached research institutions to ask these difficult questions, the default has been, we have a community advisory board. In several current COVID-19 trials, communities are consulted once all of the other work is done. It should be outrageous to us that researchers engage communities where research will happen only once a protocol is finalized. We have current COVID-19 trials in this country where communities have never seen the protocol, they were never engaged on the protocol, researchers have simply arrived and the trial is moving ahead. So it speaks to the integrity of how that research will ultimately be carried out. And it also speaks to the eventual hesitancy of those communities to embrace and use products of research post-trial. So logically, surely it would go to follow that if you're conducting research in a community, it's in your best interests, it's in the donor's best interests, it's in the government's best interests to ensure that that community is meaningfully involved from protocol design stage to the end of that trial. So transparency must be ongoing throughout the life of the trial. It can't be a pre-trial engagement with civil society when you kick off or before the launch, and then a second engagement where the trial has been paused, as we saw with Oxford here in South Africa, or stopped early or ended. This transparency and the mutual accountability has to keep going throughout the lifespan of research. So research must embody a conscious standard of care, not only looking at what is publicly available, but what is ethical and what is the right thing to do by communities that make the science possible. Post-trial access of products should not only be for participants, but for all populations at high risk. A few more thoughts on engagement for equity. We've asked ourselves some of these questions. How is science meeting communities at the place of need? Slim spoke to some of the issues around these really, really specialized refrigerators and cold temperatures. A question we ask is, what was the engagement like from the donors and from the supporters of that research to better understand that what is the role of South African institutions in this case, who fund and support research to ensure that the results of that research are context relevant in addition to being scientifically sound. I think one of our ultimate goals, of course, is advocating for a regulator in South Africa that is socially conscious. But while we think of all of that, we also have to follow the money. We want to know what COVID-19 research has our government funded and on what terms. In terms of prioritization, we're thinking about what does equity look like in rollout? How do we communicate the scientific justification for prioritization around groups over 65, healthcare workers and other essential healthcare workers, and those living with comorbidities? How widely has the WHO consulted communities and these specific communities on the draft allocation framework for vaccine? The MAC needs to continue sharing crucial information that has already been cited as good practice. This will lay the ground for the inevitable prioritization discussion that needs to happen. And the weight of that discussion happening will rest yet again on the shoulders of civil society. We need to urgently respond to calls from civil society about the development of a vaccine access and allocation plan, and civil society needs to ensure that regular parliamentary briefings by national COVID stakeholders are held to strengthen accountability of research and contribute to decision-making discussions around access. What does rollout look like? What do we say to people who do not fall into these prioritized categories? How, for example, do we manage expectations around resourcing while agitating for conscious funding of access? When in 2020, public officials in Nelson Mandela Bay Metro were arrested for corruption totaling 56.4 million rands. That's over 90,000 Pfizer vaccinations. Our national response must be grounded in our context and rampant theft of resources that could be supporting access to a COVID vaccine. We cannot have these COVID-19 discussions in isolation, colleagues. Lastly, some final thoughts. We support the call for people's vaccine and call on the president to give meaning to his signature on that pledge and transition those commitments to action. We call for the fixing of the patent laws. The president must urgently reform South Africa's patent laws. We need to strengthen our engagement with the AU to support the vaccine roadmap that must be grounded in an accountability framework. We have to commit to leveraging all available TRIPS flexibilities in the SA patent system as a priority to preempt and place lives first. We need to continue demanding that research that receives public funding is held to account and must be transparent in their dealings with government and pharma. We call on the Department of Trade to urgently reform South Africa's IP system in line with the intellectual property policy of 2018. We must strengthen community-based monitoring of the public health system, where the vaccine will ultimately land, through programs like Richidze implemented by the Treatment Action Campaign, which takes 400 public healthcare centers and empowers communities to meaningfully and proactively monitor the performance of those community healthcare systems. So colleagues, community engagement is not a luxury, it's an imperative, and it directly increases the return on investment in research. Meaningful community engagement must be budgeted and paid for by governments and those who fund and carry out research. Government must continue, as they have been doing through the MAC, to share the data behind the decisions that impact the lives of communities. We need to fund a cohesive approach to vaccine hesitancy and proactively address the spread of misinformation through the implementation of existing law enforcement frameworks. This also ties into the anti-vaxxer movement and asking ourselves hard questions around what is our ownership of the anti-vaxxer movement. What have we done or not done to ensure that a critical mass of civil society is brought along on this journey? What does our work with people living with HIV look like? Practitioners of traditional healing and indigenous medicine, faith-based groups. It took us many years to get that right in the HIV space, but we did it. And we need to learn on this, we need to lean on this engagement model to support access and eventual uptake and confidence in a COVID-19 vaccine. All tools, equipment, supplies, and medication used in the COVID-19 response must be classified as public goods. No exclusivity and no profiteering. Make public the access agreements, and I want to belabor this point, make public the access agreements for COVID-19 trials happening in South Africa, using South African participants, supported by South African public funds, and located in South African registered research organizations and institutes. Activists should not have to spend already limited resources to file access to information applications around the world as they are doing in a pandemic to force researchers to be accountable to the public. Colleagues, I want to end by saying this is a moment for science to do right. This is a moment for the government to do right and for communities to ensure that happens. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tian, for that very excellent and thought-provoking overview of the very important topic of community engagement in ensuring equity and access to vaccines. You have really taken us back to reflect on how civil society has been sidelined in the research and vaccine trials efforts, and you are pleading for a way to ensure more community participation other than participation on an advisory board. You're talking, if you look at the rungs on the ladder of participation, if one has studied the work of Susan Rifkin and others, Ron Labonte, we are saying we don't want token participation, and you are calling for ways in which civil society can really hold researchers and big pharma and international bodies in particular accountable. So I think there's already been a number of questions. One in particular speaks to a question asked by Griselda Kananda on whether public confidence in the safety and efficacy of a coronavirus vaccine is also not heavily dependent upon the political context. And how is South Africa going to ensure that whatever is approved for use has citizens and politics in mind? I think maybe that's something you can reflect on. There's been a number of questions which I don't want to direct, but I know that many of them have been directed to you, Slim, from what is really required for herd immunity to whether once one has had COVID-19, are you susceptible again? And I'm sure you've seen the questions in the chat box. I'd like to give you the liberty to start responding to those you might have already picked up on, and as well as to ask Jens to feel free to respond to any of the questions already raised before we start directing questions. So if I may start with you, Professor Abdool Karim. Hello.
Thanks very much, Dr. Andrews. I was just sending out a note that I'm replying to each of the questions. And if you look into the answered box, if you click on Q&A, and if you look and you click on the box that says answered, you'll see 11 there. you will see several of the answers that I have already written are there already. So the questions I can answer, I'm putting in the answers and typing them out. If you want me to go through any of the answers specifically, Gail, I'm quite happy to do that. For example, I addressed the question of if somebody had infection, will they be tested for antibodies? And if they've got antibodies, will they don't need a vaccine? And the answer to that is that the virus, in the way in which it causes infection, it can interfere with the body's natural immune response. And so interestingly, this is not usual in vaccines, the vaccines have been able to lead to antibody responses that are better than nature. And that's because you don't have the virus interfering with the humoral immune response. So it was fascinating to see the first set of phase 1 trials that came out showing pretty high levels, well above convalescent serum. And so for that reason, it makes very good sense to simply vaccinate everybody. Whether you've been exposed in the past or not, doesn't matter. Just get vaccinated. And that's the strategy that's being adopted for pretty much most of the vaccines, if not all. So I'll stop there, Gail. I've answered several questions. So if you want to see my answers, go there. I'm not going to repeat them all. I've already typed them in. And I was busy answering another 2 or 3 when you asked me. If there's somebody who wants to raise a specific question you want me to deal with, I'm happy to do that. Especially if it's not one I've already answered. Thanks.
Okay, no, thanks, Prof, for that. Efficient and effective as usual. I'd just like to ask Mr. Pedersen if there's any questions he'd like to respond to verbally, if he hasn't typed a response. And then also to our last speaker, to Tian, and whereafter we can then go and take oral questions and some further discussion. Thank you. So would you like to weigh in, Jens?
Yes, thanks, Gail. There's a few questions in the Q&A line, and thanks for raising some of these points. One refers specifically to G20, and we've seen the news and read the news of again using the language of equitable distribution. But one doesn't have to be an expert in public health to see that the fine print or even the language in the communiques omits entire details. They're completely void of any details. So the short answer to some of the questions raised is that these are promises that are very unlikely to be met. And again, the graphs showed initially by Prof Salim shows that the talk is in one direction, whereas the walk or the buying, so to say, is in a very different, or if not opposite direction. And I don't think that's going to change. I think we are lucky in the way that COVID-19 occurred initially in resource strong or wealthy countries, because that is what has elicited a rapid development of a vaccine, which will be of benefit eventually to poorer countries. So sort of cynically speaking, the reality is, had COVID-19 occurred in poor circumstances, in poor countries to begin with, we would not have had a record a break-in development of a vaccine or warp speed, so to say. So action remains to follow through. Russell raised a question with regards to the sort of distribution, and there are other questions related to distribution in South Africa, and of course it's difficult. It may well be that private healthcare, healthcare schemes will be able to commercially access vaccines that will be made available in South Africa commercially, for the ones that can buy them as well. Whether medical aid schemes, whether the private healthcare system will go down that route, I think, would rely on their own cost-benefit analysis of vaccinating people. It remains to be seen, but the distribution in general, of course, we have guidelines from WHO which talks about identifying people most at risk, so-called frontline workers, which across the board are very likely to be the first to receive vaccines in any context. The more challenging circumstances becomes after that, and those are essentially political conversations as to what define a vulnerable group, who is most at risk, again informed by the supply or the availability of vaccines. Now, those choices and those conversations are ongoing in South Africa, as they are everywhere, but I don't know in which direction they are leaning in terms of who will be, apart from the obvious frontline healthcare workers, first ones to receive a vaccine. Thanks. Over to you, Tian.
Hi, thanks for that, Jens. I think in terms of some of the issues that Griselda is raising, I think really spot on. In terms of how do we ensure choice when the vaccine eventually does come, but in a context where we still have communities who will not wear masks because they will tell you, I do not know anyone who has died of this thing. How do you begin to speak vaccines in that context? So it's about achieving that fine balance of ensuring that essential information around how vaccine research happens, specifically around vaccine safety. And we've done some work around this with Daily Sun, which has got a huge readership. But we've been able to condense really complicated scientific concepts and research principles, specifically as they relate to safety, and share that with the communities in which we work. But that will be a long-standing challenge. In terms of healthcare workers, I mean, it's been a whirlwind. The vaccine research space has just been a whirlwind. We, at some stage, actually called on healthcare workers to remove themselves from one of the current COVID-19 vaccine trials because we could not make any comments on the safety around their participation. And this was a direct result of this particular vaccine trial saying to us, we will not engage the community on the science. The importance here is the science. So we were then stuck having to engage with some of the country's largest labor unions to then go back and say, but how are we encouraging healthcare workers to participate in trials that consistently refuse to prioritize or center community engagement and community ownership of that research? So yeah, in terms of those 2 points, communities, we urgently need to resource civil society that is doing work on the ground in those communities to build a common level of vaccine literacy in terms of supporting it, because that the failure to do that feeds directly into vaccine hesitancy, and then at a next level where we've seen some very senior politicians spouting anti-vaxxer messaging, you know, from the whole gambit, you know, from there's a microchip to the vaccine, to Bill Gates is going to track you in this vaccine, to, you know, we've seen the entire range. And that kind of information is dispelled once you have good, solid, reliable information going to community level. And so those are my responses on a few of those comments. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Tian, and also thanks to you, Jens. Now, colleagues or panelists, if you are not, if you find that we go ahead with taking some hands now, I saw Russell had raised his hand. Russell, would you like to ask a specific question to one of the panelists so that they can respond, or any points for discussion that people want to raise? Any of our participants? Russell, the floor is yours, colleague. Unmute. And then I'll give it to the next hand I see after Russell, Mr. Shlongwa.
Hi, thank you very much to the panelists for a very important and interesting conversation. I think for us, while we understand the whole issue around vaccine politics and the importance that we secure some kind of transparency in, as well as an opportunity to manufacture the vaccine locally, I think the distribution issues in South Africa are super important. And I do think this is something that the government or the National Department of Health can show leadership in. When we look at in terms of healthcare workers and others most at risks, healthcare workers are all covered by medical schemes, but shop workers in retail situations aren't covered, taxi drivers probably aren't covered, and a lot of other people who have lots of direct contact don't have access or cover from medical schemes. So I think the issue that we need to solve sooner rather than later is some kind of universal prioritization protocol that ensures that those most at risk get access to the vaccine first. And I think simultaneously, while we're having these conversations, we can continue with global campaigns that looks at vaccine transparency. But we're probably about 6 or 8 months away. And I think the important thing that we need to consider is that we are beginning to see more and more infections, particularly in my hometown of Nelson Mandela Bay. And sometimes talk of the vaccine can also deflect from the things that we need to do right now. But my closing point is that we need a national prioritization framework that is universal, that covers both the public and the private sector, and must ensure that those most at risk get access to the vaccine first. And that our ability to pay doesn't mean that we jump ahead of the queue, as a lot of the rich countries have done by pre-purchasing a lot of these vaccines. Thank you. Over.
Thanks for that question, and also comment embedded there, Russell. I'd like to open up that question for any of the panelists to respond to. Specifically, you're wanting to know, should we not have a universal prioritization process? To my understanding, I may be incorrect. There are a number of frameworks that there's the WHO framework for how we're going to do priority setting, but I will leave it to the experts here. Colleagues, can you answer that please, or Claudina?
Yes, I just want to mention that the Ministerial Advisory Committee for COVID vaccines is specifically looking at developing that equitable access to the vaccines and what the framework and the model should be for that. And they're busy finalizing an advisory specifically on that that will be put out for discussion as such. So the government is looking into that specific component to see, given the number of vaccines that will be available, when can we access and who should be given priority? And those things should be discussed in open fora as well, once it's sort of the framework has been developed. Then with regard to the vaccine manufacturing, yes, unfortunately, there's on the moment only 2 possible companies that can do it within South Africa. Aspen assigned deal with Johnson & Johnson. Unfortunately, South Africa will not benefit from that. It is sort of the way that contract manufacturing work within the pharmaceutical environment. BioVac is still in discussion for potential vaccines that can be locally manufactured, but the deals has not been finalized on that component yet. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudina, for answering that question. But in the absence, Russell, of our MAC having put out an advisory, there is a framework already accessible on the internet on how to prioritize which groups of people should be getting the vaccine, should we have it, but also, you know, the values and principles that must inform it. If that's satisfactorily answered, then I'll go to Ketani Shlongwa.
Hello, Gail.
Yes.
I think, look, I don't think it's satisfactorily answered, and I do think it's something that we should have actually addressed at the beginning of the pandemic. We already, currently as it stands, in the absence of universal protocols, people are dying because they can't access healthcare services or they access them too late. Whereas people in the private sector seem to be able to access services for COVID with ease. And I think there has to be some lessons that we can learn from that so that we don't fall into the same traps and keep deferring these conversations. Yesterday, the Minister of Finance also indicated that we're allocating over 4.5 billion rand from next year's budget towards this COVAX facility, specifically to deal with local manufacture. And if the Aspen deal is not going to be benefiting South Africa, I think it's important that we understand what are the plans currently in place if we already know what kind of number we're allocating from a very constrained budget already. Thank you. But I understand that we can't answer all these questions, but they are there. And I think the sooner that we get a public, open, transparent process on prioritization, the sooner we can put a lot of these issues to bed. Thank you.
Okay, no,
Over.
thanks, Russell. You mean specifically for South Africa, but I'd like Prof Abdool Karim maybe, because I've seen there was a number of questions also as to how the COVAX facility will work and what is South Africa going to be purchasing. If you do have any information to elaborate on Claudina's feedback, Slim, it will be appreciated.
Sure, thanks, Dr. Andrews. So I want to raise a projection based on what we have seen. Let's, for argument, say that of the 12 candidates currently in phase 3 trials, that we get 10 of their results by January, mid-January, as I think we're likely to see. And I think we're going to see most of them being highly efficacious. And the reason I'm saying that is that when you look at their phase 1 data, the antibody levels that they generate in animal studies is fairly similar. They all pretty much generate similar immune responses in animals, pretty high levels, much higher than convalescent serum. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I'm expecting we will likely have somewhere between 8 to 10 vaccine candidates, different classes and so on. That means that by the end of next year, if all of the companies pursue their manufacturing plans as they've laid them out now, we will have somewhere in the region of around 4 to 5 billion doses. And that's before even scaling up, based on results of efficacy. So that means that by the end of next year, we should have enough doses for half the world's populations. So that's a lot of doses to have. Now, that gives us, and if I estimate correctly, we're likely to see a scaling up occur quite rapidly, with the cheapest ones, the easiest ones to make, because there'll be huge demand for them, that they can be scaled up. So our plan in terms of ratcheting up needs to be able to ratchet up quite quickly. So while we're following all of the international guidance on, we're going to do healthcare workers first, we're then going to do the elderly, and we're going to do those with comorbidities and essential workers, and then roll it out, we're going to find that while we're doing step 1, which takes several months, we've got enough vaccines to go to step 2 and enough vaccines to go to step 3. So we've got to be able to concertina this whole initiative, because the quicker we can get to the young people, the more important it becomes, because they are the transmitters. Not they are everybody who's got the virus is a transmitter, but they are potentially bigger transmitters because of the interactions that they have with other young people and the fact that they have a lot of asymptomatic disease. So we want to get as quickly as possible to that situation. in my view, the way in which to do that is to try and secure as much vaccine as we can to get to about 10% of the population right now. So that gets us through healthcare workers and so on, because the rest of it, we want to have a lot of choice. We want to pick and choose between the 8 to 10 candidates. We want to negotiate with them, and we're going to want to get, the vaccine that and there may be vaccines we can make in this country. There are, especially if it's a protein subunit, we have the capacity. We can do that in this country. We actually do that routinely for animals right now. We'd have to establish the technology and do that. So I want to make that point that we shouldn't get too hung up on the issues relating to scarcity and so on, because we might find that it's an issue that gets itself resolved soon.
Okay, so thank you for that, Professor Abdool Karim. I see there's still 3 hands up. Kitani, can you please raise your question for us? Can you just unmute her?
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Claudina and Dr. Andrews. My question relates to the development of the vaccines, and I'm just interested to find out that with regards to children, we understand that their pharmacokinetics differ to those of adults. If any of the current candidate vaccines have had a look at the dosage requirements or are testing the vaccines with children. Thank you.
Professor
Shall I
Karim,
answer that?
you're the only one.
Okay, no, I can answer that pretty easily. So right now, most of the current vaccine trials go down to adolescents, but not to children, not to newborns and so on. And the main reason for that is that children below the age of around 15 have very low incidence of the infection. Partly because they, they just have a low susceptibility biologically, and there's a range of other reasons. So it's very hard to do vaccine trials in a population like that where you're not going to see endpoints. So those will be done as bridging studies to get the dosing correct. And they're not a high priority because they don't get the infection very commonly. But right now, almost all the 4 vaccines we have enough data that will enable us to vaccinate, other than the very small children. We know what the dose will be to vaccinate children that are in the adolescent period. So the newborns and the very young ones still to be determined.
Thank you for that. I see Arisa also raised her hand. Arisa, if it's anything unfortunate to do with the COVAX facility, nobody on this panel has actually got the full details on what is going on and what is the government's specific commitment. And I think if it's possible that you will raise a question if it's not related to the COVAX facility. Thank you. And then the last hand is Ruth. If you can unmute her, if she's still got a question. Ruth, please go ahead. No, we seems to have lost her. Is there any one of the other panelists that still got any of the questions they would like to respond to? Jens or Tian?
Nothing that is immediately apparent, Claudina.
Okay, thank you then. In that case, I would like to introduce Professor Annie Temani. She is very much involved with the whole COVID response, the bioethics. She's also serving on the Bioethics Council from the MRC as well as UNESCO one. And she will provide us a summary and an overview of the discussions as such. Annie, over to you. You are on mute, Annie.
I'm sorry, I was trying my video first. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank our panelists for embracing us with their presence. But what I've heard from what we've been discussing, the most important thing is transparency. Transparency around about the access and equity, and about how the vaccines will be manufactured. I think these are important conversations that needs to be generated throughout up until we get to the vaccine in South Africa. So from Prof Karim, what I like is the quote of the runaway COVID pandemic is showing no signs of slowing down at all, and which is true. And then the key 5 things that need to be chosen for the vaccine. I think those are the things that we need to take into consideration: the safety, the efficacy, the cost, the ease of storage, and whether it's going to be single dose or a double dose. Because the goal is all about prevention and protecting people from COVID. And from Jens, what is important is about Africa should stand on its own in order to manufacture its own vaccine. But like Prof Karim has already said, we have already started with this with animals. So if we can do it on our own and not buy vaccines from the wealthy countries, and that is important. And from Tian, from the civil society, I think we should not underestimate their call to action for researchers to conduct their research in research integrity, and they must be accountable, and there must be access agreements that are available to everyone. And then in order for us to meet that goal for that access for equity. And I think also ethics plays an important role in this regard when we're looking to access and equity. Lastly, I'd like to thank the honorable guests again, and our webinar organizer team, Prof Safia, Dr. Gail, Claudina, and Mungi, sitting in the background and assisting us with this webinar, and Prof Dai, the chairperson of UNESCO. Thank you very much, Prof, for your support. And lastly, to your participants, to embrace us with your presence in the afternoon. And we will see you again in the next webinar. Stay safe and keep well.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for those closing remarks, Prof. And thanks again to all our participants. The webinar is now closed. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Great pleasure being with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Slim.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tian. Thanks, Jens.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for organizing.